Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you all for coming to a very special event here at the Mortara Center today. My name is Victor Cha. I'm a professor of government and director of Asian Studies in the School of Foreign Service at Georgetown. And we, the Asian Studies program, along with the Mortara Center and the Center for Eastern European Studies, are very happy to celebrate a new book by one of our colleagues, Professor James Millward. As many of you know, Professor Millward is the professor of intersocietal history at the School of Foreign Service and in the Department of History here at Georgetown. He teaches a variety of classes on Chinese, Central Asian, and world history at the undergraduate and graduate levels. His research interests focus on China, Central Asia, including Mongolia, Tibet, and especially Xinjiang, as well as the Silk Road more generally. He has written extensively on the Qing Empire, Xinjiang, the Silk Road, and is currently studying cross-cultural musical exchanges and working on a history of lutes across Eurasia and a book on the globalization of the guitar. He has served on the China and Inter-Asia Council of the Association of Asian Studies, as well as on the executive board of the Central Eurasian Studies Society. He was president of the Central Eurasian Studies Society in 2010. When Jim is not busy teaching and writing and researching, he is performing. He is a member of the Washington, D.C. area band By and By. And so you can catch, when's your next gig?
We've got a wedding coming up, but I don't think everyone's invited to that. Every fourth Thursday at a place called Argonaut on H Street.
Or we can all crash the next wedding performing at. But like I said, we're very happy to be celebrating this the release of his new book, The Silk Road, by Oxford University Press. It is not a introduction, not a short introduction, but a very short introduction to the book, perfect size for riding the train or riding the plane, which I guess is part of the idea behind the book. The way we shall proceed is Professor Millward will start out with some initial comments, reflections about his work and about the book. Then Professor Loring will moderate the question and answer. And I think even though this goes till about 6:30, we're going to probably stop around 6:15, since one of the main purposes is to whet your appetite for the book so that you go out and buy it. And then Jim can sign a bunch of copies for you. So we want to leave some time for that, of course, at the end of the session. And so with that, again, we're very happy to celebrate this special occasion with Jim, and I'll turn the floor over to you.
All right, well, thank you all for coming out, and thanks to the series program and the Asian Studies program for sponsoring the event, and for buying us the jiaozi and the mante and the pelmeni, which smell really good, and I see you all eating them. My stomach is rumbling, but I have to wait. I didn't want to have dill in my teeth or chives in my teeth while speaking to you all. So as Victor showed you the book, it is a very little book. It's in the series which Oxford Press puts out of very short introductions, and I think they now have 365 of them. On philosophers and things like quantum physics and Foucault and all sorts of fun stuff like that. And they sell them in these special stands. I'm sure you've seen them here and there. You can buy a bunch of them. They're kind of like candy. So I saw those stands and I was very attracted by it and wanted to buy them. I found myself wanting to buy these books myself when I saw them. And so I pitched this idea of the Silk Road to them. And my editor said, okay, that sounds good. So you're going to talk us about, sort of camel caravans and exotic locales and this and that. And I said, well, sort of. And she said, silk and damasks and these kinds of things and spices. And I said, well, not exactly. I mean, actually, what I want to do is argue that the Silk Road does not exist. So this is kind of a buzzkill. But I try and make up for it a little bit by countering another common belief about the Silk Road, which is that it has died. And I'm going to argue that the Silk Road will never really existed, at least in the way that everybody thinks it did, but at least it's still alive today. So I'll try and explain some of those conundrums to you in the course of my remarks this afternoon. But first I want to go through some of the ways in which the idea of the Silk Road and the concept of the Silk Road are still very much with us. And I'll begin here. This is an article published by a man named Wang Jisi. I don't know if Victor has run into him or not. He's a very well-known political scientist. He's Dean of the School of International Studies at Beijing University. And he was named last year by Foreign Policy magazine as one of its top 100 global thinkers. And in this article, he coined a phrase, as those of you who can read Chinese can see, March West, as part of a new policy to increase Chinese diplomatic attention and economic investment in continental Eurasia, as opposed to the Pacific region where U.S. rivalry is greatest and the potential for dangerous frictions high. What interested me about this sort of new proposal for a rebalancing, as he calls it, a rebalancing of China's foreign policy, is that in talking about it, he uses a lot of terms from ancient Chinese history, particularly terms referring to the far west. He calls the West, from China's point of view, the Western regions, which is a term that goes back to the Han Dynasty. And it evokes earlier periods of China's history when its dynasties had glorious epochs of expansion into Central Asia, the Han Dynasty and the Tang Dynasty. He argues in the course of talking about it, saying that this region is rich in energy resources. There would be eager diplomatic and trade partners for China there. Certainly there are problems, and so it would not be a pure land paradise. And here he's evoking a Buddhist term for an imaginary paradise in the West. But nonetheless, the way would be clear to rapidly construct a new Silk Road under China's leadership. So Silk Road, Pure Land Paradises, Western regions, all of these were ancient terms in Chinese for places to the west from the era of the Silk Road. So this notion of the Silk Road, regardless of what scholars like me might say, is still very alive and current and has political resonances, which I'll talk about a little bit later. The idea of the Silk Road, though, is actually, and the term, is not an ancient one at all. It was coined first only in the 19th century by a German geographer, Ferdinand van Richthofen. He used the term Seidenstrasse and Seidenstrassen in both singular and plural, referring to China's trade in silk, which he believed connected China to Rome at the time of the Han Dynasty and the Roman Empire. Now, this term came into English in various ways as Silk Road, Silk Routes, Silk Roads, and so on. And what I have here is a Google Ngram. I don't know if any of you have seen this, but it's a chart of the occurrences of this term in all the books that Google has scanned so far. And this was restricted to English. I did try it in German and Chinese, and I don't think they've scanned enough books in German and Chinese. But as you can see, the term Silk Route has actually been more common than Silk Road, at least in those books, although Silk Road has been rising. And there's sort of a rearguard action coming from Silk Roads, catching up in the early 2000s and passing Silk Routes. I'm hoping that by the time Google has scanned up to 2013, we'll see Silk Road go through the roof when all of you buy my book and it gets around, but we'll see. So anyway, we see these various versions of this term have picked up only from the 19th century and have become more or less current. But it's not really clear what this term means. What regions are we talking about with the Silk Road? What time periods are we talking about? What exactly passed on the Silk Road? There's a lot of impressions out there and a lot of things are said about it, but it's not very clear. In fact, the Silk Road can mean all sorts of crazy things, as we see from this coffee house in Tokyo, with this wonderful image of can-can dancers along the top of the Shirokurodo cafe. So their idea of Silk Road, I suppose, includes silk knickers. Now, Silk Road is a very marketable a very marketable meme, a very marketable idea. Travel agencies cash in on it to sell tours to almost anywhere, it seems, from Venice to Vladivostok. Restaurateurs, too, recognize its allure. To take restaurants selling just Uyghur food and advertising their name in English, one may find Silk Road restaurants in Beijing, Shanghai, Toronto, Etobicoke, Sydney, Adelaide, Oakley, and London. But a Silk Road restaurant need have little to do with Central Asia. Silk Road is to Asian fusion in the 21st century what the tiki bar was to Chinese Polynesian food in the mid-20th. Anyone remember tiki bars? Right here in Georgetown, we had a neighborhood Silk Road restaurant, Me and You. I don't know if any of you have ever been there. And they served food which they called on their website Silk Road-inspired regional American cuisine in a decor that I describe as Nouvelle Seraglio. There's a Silk Road restaurant in Missoula, Montana, serving tapas. A Silk Road restaurant in Walnut Creek, California, which was recently voted the best Greek restaurant. And a Silk Road cafe in an Irish castle with what's been called the best Middle Eastern North African cuisine in Dublin. In music and dance, the notion of the Silk Road often suggests a kind of Sino-Islamic mashup that inspired Puccini's Turandot. We have some images of the opera there. But the musical and choreographic origins of what could be called Silk Road music could derive from anywhere in the old world. Besides Yo-Yo Ma's, here we have Yo-Yo Ma, as you all know. Besides Yo-Yo Ma's broadly based Silk Road ensemble, we have, for example, the Silk Road music of an Indo-Persian trio known as Ghazal, made up of a sitarist and a gijek player and a tabla player playing Hindustani and Persian music together. But the earliest and possibly the first musician to commercially assume the Silk Road mantle was none other than Kitaro, whose synthesizer compositions helped launch the entire genre of New Age music. Kitaro provided background music for the long-running Japanese television series On the Silk Road. But I remember it best pumped from speakers from a hot tub place in Santa Cruz, where I went during graduate school, just a few steps away from an old school bus that had been repainted with purple lotus flowers. So. Is Carol Benedict here, by the way? Yeah. Do you remember, you went to Santa Cruz, right? Oh, and there's my wife. So she remembers the hot tub place. I don't know if Carol ever went there. All right. Now the Silk Road has made its entrance into fashion as well. For its 2011 autumn-winter season, Oscar de la Renta looked to the Silk Road and rolled out a, quote, magic carpet ride complete with Ottoman jackets embroidered in the manner of Bukhara carpets, jewel-like costumes from the court of Cixi, Dragon Empress of China, North African threadwork, patchwork paisley tunics, ostrich feather skirts, and gigantic Genghis Khan fox hats. No doubt such outfits could be well complemented by Le Métier de Beauté's 2011 Fall-Winter collection, introducing Silk Road, a journey of discovery and luxurious sensuality. The Silk Road Kaleidoscope eyeshadow palette features shades appropriately called tapestry, damask, ikat, and brocade, which appropriately enough for a Silk Road product may be, quote, layered and intertwined, however one wishes. And don't forget their East Meets West nail lacquer collection, $95 at Neiman Marcus. Now there's also an online marketplace called Silk Road, where one can buy, for example, a gram of Afghani hash, 1/8 of an ounce of sour weed, 14 grams of ecstasy, or a gram of tar heroin. There's no plutonium for sale here, since the website prohibits sale of anything whose purpose is to harm or defraud, such as stolen credit cards, assassinations, and weapons of mass destruction. And one must access the place through the secretive Tor network, which conceals your identity. And all purchases are made in the digital currency Bitcoin, which has been in the news lately for another reason. But you can order with confidence from sellers who are rated on a system just like that used by Amazon and eBay, and professionally packed packages are delivered within a few days to your house. But perhaps the most interesting recent deployments of the Silk Road idea have been political. In the 2002 Smithsonian Silk Road Festival, which was a fabulous event, I don't know if any of you had a chance to attend any of their music and wrestling and paper making and all sorts of activities they had there. But this festival had a subtext as well. It was staged in the aftermath of 9/11 while the drums of war in Iraq were pounding down the street at 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue. The festival brought people from a range of Islamic countries to the National Mall under the banner, "Connecting Cultures, Creating Trust." And this notion of the Silk Road as an arena where cultures come together in a peaceful way has been reflected and amplified very strongly in high school and college textbooks, in some television documentaries and things like this, which present the Silk Road as kind of a multiculturalist and even neoliberal story, tending against the Huntingtonian class of civilizations approach to international affairs. And it does this mainly by sort of applauding the efforts of private actors, private merchants, and religious professionals in promoting diversity, promoting connections, and transnational tolerance across the old world. More recently, though, this Silk Road concept has been deployed in an even more pointed manner. Wang Jisi was not the first to draw on the concept for a foreign policy framework. The Silk Road is frequently evoked in diplomatic discourse today as a shorthand for the region, including China, Central Asia, South Asia, Iran, Turkey, Russia, India. But this is done to convey a variety of different messages. In July of 2011, Secretary of State Hillary Clinton rolled out a foreign policy rubric in a speech in Chennai, India, pointing out that, quote, "Historically, the nations of South and Central Asia were connected to each other and the rest of the continent by a sprawling trading network called the Silk Road." Notice the places she mentions, South and Central Asia. That's her Silk Road, like that. The U.S. just branded its efforts to heighten India's influence, spur economic integration in the region, smooth border crossing for goods and people, ease India-Pakistan tensions, and help with Afghanistan's development, with a slogan based on this historical concept of the Silk Road. As you see, let's work together to create a new Silk Road was her idea. Now, of course, the Secretary's north-south corridor of South and Central Asia, possibly intentionally, leaves out key Silk Road participants to the immediate west and east. Yet China and Iran, too, eagerly embrace the Silk Road idea. On the occasion of the 40th anniversary of diplomatic ties between Iran and China, Iran's Foreign Minister Ali Akbar Salehi noted that the Islamic Republic of Iran and the People's Republic of China are two civilized countries and enjoy an ancient history, and the Silk Road, which has worldwide fame, is considered the historical symbol of relations between our two nations. So this diplomatic boilerplate that he was using accurately highlights the antiquity and foundational nature of both Persian and Sinnic civilizations. A key aspect of both countries' self-identity that has often been neglected by the West in its more imperious moments. And later in the same year, get to them in a minute, later in the same year, the quasi-official Global Times, Chinese tabloid, the Global Times, was responding to this American Silk Road strategy, and in particular to the U.S. outreach to Burma. And their response was an editorial advising that China should, quote, "revive the Silk Road, smash American containment." So you could revive the Silk Road as an anti-American gesture in that parlance. When the Pakistan President Asif Ali Zardari needed to apologize for an allegation that Uyghur militants or Uyghurs who had caused some demonstrations and violent activity in far western China, in Xinjiang, it had been alleged that they were trained in Pakistan. And in his apology for this, which he delivered in Urumqi at the International Urumqi Trade Fair in Xinjiang, in trying to mend fences, he used the Silk Road reference. He promised cooperation and pledged that the Silk Road will be fully revived. And perhaps that pledge worked. So the Silk Road then can clearly mean all sorts of things. My daughter, for example, when I asked her what it meant to her, she'd been introduced to it in her geography classes and history classes when she was in lower school and middle school. She admitted that to her it had always evoked the image of the ribbon road in early versions of the Mario Kart video game. And she'd always thought of it as something like that. Now, the textbooks are actually not that bad. They have a lot of useful things, very important things to say about it. They do always draw it as a line on the map, which I'll get to in a moment. They do tend to, the textbooks and TV documentaries and even world historians, though, tend to emphasize certain points about the Silk Road, certain things that everybody understands and believes about it, but which I find somewhat problematic. And that's what I'm going to talk about in the remainder of my comments here today. So, we all know that it was a road, or maybe roads, or routes, running across Asia. And there was also a maritime version, a sea version of the Silk Road. We know that merchant caravans traveled along it. They carried silk, other luxuries, from east to west, most spectacularly from China all the way to Rome and back. And we know the Silk Road was something ancient, but it came to an end at one point or another. All right. So, first of all, this notion that there is a road or even routes that we should talk about as the Silk Road. This comes, of course, from the original formulation of the Silk Road by the German geographer, but it's also something which cartographers have latched onto. Right? If you're drawing an illustration for a history textbook, it's great to draw a line on the map. And even the cartographer who was doing my maps in this book, I submitted all my information and my cities and so on and so forth, and they came back to me, where do I draw the Silk Road? And I said, you're not going to draw the Silk Road on the map. And so it took some explaining. But in fact, there was no route like Route 66, spanning the continent, on which merchants would take their camels and go from one end to another. And of course, if you think about it, that sort of makes sense, right? There's no Roman road all the way from the Mediterranean to the Pacific like this. It makes much more sense to think about the Silk Road as a system of communications, as a set of nodes, trading entrepot, cities, oases, and various routes between them, networks of routes between them, some going over mountains, some across deserts, some by sea, some by land, but no one particular line like that. Obviously, in some places, certain routes are easier to travel than others, but there's no single route like this that you can easily map. Likewise, there were never mass quantities of anything going across these routes. And as I'll say in a moment, the idea of going all the way from one end of the continent to the other, we tend to exaggerate that when we think about what the Silk Road really meant. So there's a kind of a presentist bias. We think of routes, we think of highways, we think of commodity trade, and that flavors and somehow distorts how we understand ancient trade in the old world. But if what we mean when we talk about the Silk Road is no less than the whole network of exchanges across Eurasia from ancient times, then the Silk Road is no longer a particular concrete thing that you can map or that someone could travel on or that could come to an end, but rather an ongoing process or an ongoing system. And that's how I tend to approach it. Now let's look at some of these other understood aspects of the Silk Road. First of all, this idea that it is, that the most important aspect of the Silk Road is it's put in service by merchants as a way of moving goods around and moving goods across. There's actually very little evidence of this. I mean, we have goods and things that show up in different places, but what evidence we have of particularly larger scale exchanges, so large amounts of Chinese silk showing up in Central Asia, for example, or of specie, precious metals, and so on. What examples we have of that indicate that it wasn't merchants moving this around, but states. The largest amounts of goods and valuable products that were ever moved were done by empires supporting their armies, supporting their garrisons, in particular the Chinese state, far away from their centers. Where we do have records of particular exchanges, and we have a few of these from groups of people known as the Sogdians, who were the most famous silk roadies of all time. They show up everywhere from Armenia to Korea, and in China and in between. But where we have records of exchange, it suggests that most of this trade was small scale, small amounts of things, much more local or regional rather than extremely long distance. So that's the kind of trade that was in private hands. Goods were moved by relay, not by one merchant taking it the whole way. So in other words, there were very few Marco Polos, people like him, going the whole distance. We also tend to focus on this east-west axis. But we really shouldn't, because among the most important kind of exchanges that happened on the Silk Road, and this is something that work by David Christian and Thomas Olson has brought out. Among the most important exchanges was exchanges between the sedentary world of big agrarian empires and nomadic states in the Central Eurasian steppes. Moving of silk and of other goods, either as tributes to appease the nomads or to supply their demand for luxuries and things like this. These were in high quantities. Again, these are the kind of records that we actually have in Chinese and sometimes Persian records as well. And we, in thinking about sort of merchants moving between the great urban centers of Eurasia, we tend to neglect a very important role which these nomad states had, namely of actually shaping and characterizing what was moved by their demand. When a group like the Mongols, for example, dominated Eurasia, they wanted certain sorts of things, and they wanted certain sorts of artisans to come back and forth and to make them things. The Turks were like that, and even in more recent times, Kazakhs, in some research I've done elsewhere, we have records of Kazakhs telling Chinese officials, well, we want brocades in this kind of color, we want damasks in this kind of color. No, we don't like red, we like that light blue color. And the orders would go out to the silk manufacturers in South China, and a year or so later, these kind of shipments would come back. And so the consumer demand of nomad states was actually very, very important in determining what kinds of things were moved. And finally, we have what I call, in a kind of tongue-in-cheek way, the problem of peripherocentrism. I just like that word, peripherocentrism, right? It's an oxymoron. What do I mean by that? Namely, this focus we have on Rome and China. And where does that come from? That comes from the sort of wow factor of the great distances between the Mediterranean and China. And the idea that if something like silk moved all the way from one end to the other in pre-modern times, so that's quite impressive. And indeed it would be. But there's very little evidence at any point of direct contact between China and Rome. There are contacts with the Mediterranean and so on. And then later on there's contacts with Byzantium. But there are no Roman coins, for example, in any territory near China. Far more important for the functioning of the Silk Road, or for this system of exchanges across Eurasia, are places in the middle, not in the ends. So Persia, India. And they're important both as entrepot and also as sources of ideas and goods, and technologies and artistic motifs, of biological materials such as types of vegetables and crops. Sources of those things that came out of the sort of center of the continent and then spread in both directions. And the lutes, for example, that I'm working on in some other research, the origins of the pipa in East Asia, or the oud in the Arab lands, or the lute in Europe. That instrument we think began in Persia or in Afghanistan, and from there spread out and changed only slightly in going in these sorts of directions. And so we shouldn't neglect then the middle reaches of this system. And we also tend to think, and I've been talking today quite a bit about the movement of a good, movement of a specific item from one place to the other. But in fact, there are much more complicated ways in which these exchanges took place. Often it was ideas, technologies that were traveling with people. Often there were experts, artisans, who moved themselves or who were brought in, sometimes kidnapped by nomad states, moved from one place to another, and they reproduced similar items from one place in another, rather than the physical item itself moving. And there are many, many cases of hybridized objects or hybridized ideas that you can't really say it began in one place or another, but that there's clearly common features or common uses. One example of that is the notion of the halo, which appears in very, very early Zoroastrian contexts. It appears in Buddhist contexts, in Buddhist sculpture. Also, Christianity obviously adopts it later on. And I want to give another example of how, when we talk about exchanges across Eurasia, very often we're not talking about something moving from one place to another, but rather of a shared, what I call a trans-Eurasian cultural substratum. And this is first example of these. I have 3 examples to give. The first of these is a particular type of story, sort of short stories, often stories with a moral, often stories that involve animals. So we're familiar with these from the tradition of Aesop's fables, for example. But very similar, in fact, many of the same stories show up around the same time as we think the earliest Aesop's fables were. In Buddhist tales, a genre of tale called the Jataka stories, which tell stories of the Buddha's past lives before he became a Buddha, when he was running around as a bodhisattva doing good things to help the myriad beings. And so he's there as an animal in various of these sort of animal types of stories. And then when it comes time for the moral, the story collections of these Jataka tales will have the Buddha giving a moral in a more recent time. And in that context, we see Aesop's fables and these Buddha tales completely intermixed, and in a way that you can't say, well, they began in India or they began in Greece. They're part of this sort of common subculture. Many of them later show up in another Buddhist or another Indian collection called the Panchatantra. They show up in the Arabic collection Kalila Vadima, in 1001 Nights, in Boccaccio's Decameron, even in Chaucer's Canterbury Tales, drawing on this same underlying pool. Stories from that same source as well moved in the East Asian direction. They show up in Chinese and Mongolian, Japanese, Korean folk stories. Often with a slight change, so the story of the monkey and the crocodile becomes the rabbit and the dragon, but it's the same story, just the names have been changed. Just wanted to show you one example of some of this hybridization. This is a sculpture from 1st or 2nd century AD from Gandhara, that's near modern Kandahar in Afghanistan, where there was both Hellenic and Indic influence on the Buddhist sculpture there. And you can see that in this duo, the Buddha on the left has a halo, right, as I mentioned before. The robes show the influence of Mediterranean, of sort of Greco-Roman Hellenic style. But the figure on the right, who's a protector of the Buddha, is holding a club. He's dressed in a lion skin, and in his other hand he's holding what's known as a vajra, or a thunderbolt. And he is simultaneously both Vajrapani, who's one of the bodhisattvas traditionally displayed as a protector of the Buddha, and also Hercules in his lion skin holding a club with that big beard. Here's another Gandharan sculpture. I put this on my midterm exam for my students in my Central Eurasian class and asked them what it was. None of them went for it. They hadn't seen it before. None of them dared to guess, but I bet you guys can do better. What is this depicting? Yeah, I think I'm hearing it. Say it. Trojan horse, exactly, a horse on wheels. What else could it be? And then the sort of woman over there in the doorway, I suppose, would be Helen of Troy, right? Well, this is from Gandhara, from Afghanistan, and it shows Hellenic influence there, but also the Indian influence on how the woman is conveyed. I think they were just too timid to guess that. Another example of this kind of, sort of shared trans-Eurasian tradition that studying the Silk Road makes us see is in blue and white ware, or Qinghua as it's known in Chinese. Now, of course, when we think of this kind of blue and white China as quintessentially Chinese. If you think of a Ming vase, close your eyes, you're going to think of something blue and white like this. But actually it began and became most popular in China during the Mongol period, under Mongol rule, and with Mongol imperial patronage. And it requires not only Chinese very hot-fired kaolin porcelain, but cobalt oxide glazes, which were imported, or pigments, which were imported from Persia. So it was during the Mongol period where these pigments were most easily available in China, and under Mongol patronage that more and more of this began to be made and began to be spread throughout areas of the Mongol Empire. And of course, even after the Mongol period, throughout the Islamic world, Iran, the Ottoman Empire, ultimately, of course, to Holland, and to other places in Europe, this style of pottery became extremely popular. Now, the images that we're looking at here, on the top left is a Ming, whoops, giving away my punchline there. On the top left is a Chinese plate from the Ming period, so after the Mongols. On the right, we have one from the Ottoman, with that very famous Ottoman tulip design. Down below, this is from Delft in Holland. And the Dutch, by the way, were, once they opened maritime trade to East Asia, started importing this stuff by the ton in the hulls of their ships known as carracks, or cracks, or krak as it's known in Dutch. So if you get to this point in my book, you'll see my worst pun of all, which is that the Dutch were hooked on krak. And then this final example is of willow ware, sort of, after this process of putting blue and white on China was industrialized in Britain. And I remember when I was growing up at the local supermarket, they would give away one of these plates every week for housewives who were doing their shopping. And you could build up your China set with these kinds of cheap industrialized versions of the old blue and white ware. So of course China was not the first place to knock off luxury goods and sell them cheaply. All right. So in other words, one can talk about blue and white and see it as Chinese, but really the evolution of this tradition and of this style and of the technology and so on is something that's carried out across Eurasia and relies upon trans-Eurasian contacts in order to create it. And now we come, of course, to what I call the Mante-Pelmeni Jiaozi complex. And here I'm talking about not all dumplings, but particular kind of meat, or sometimes it's vegetable-filled dumpling with a folded outside skin like this, which of course ravioli is one as well. And I bring this up with some trepidation because I've seen whole rooms just melt down into very acrimonious debate over whether this and other pasta began in Italy or began in China. And your answer to that question depends, I think, on your passport. And we have no real records, but there is a desiccated, fossilized dumpling which was found in far western China, but basically in Central Asia along the desert routes, dating from possibly the 7th century. But since it's from some point in the middle, it doesn't really answer that question of where it all began. There is a name, though, by which this kind of dumpling goes in many, many societies, something like mante, or mantu, or mandu. Korean is manduk, Victor, is it, or mandu? Mandu, right? And the Chinese name is jiaozi, but there's another somewhat similar kind of bread product known as mantou, which I think is a cognate word. And then in all the Turkic languages, and from there into Persian, Afghanistan and so on, these are known as mante. And we don't know the origins of this word either, whether it was initially Chinese and spread to Central Asia or the other way around. But this too is very much a Silk Road product and a shared part of Eurasian tradition. Okay, finally to this notion of whether the Silk Road ended or not. The argument goes that with the opening of maritime communications, maritime trade, all the way from Western Europe and the Mediterranean directly to East Asia, that since it's cheaper to move goods by sea than it is overland, this must have had some sort of economic effects on the Silk Road itself. And this was put forward initially by Russian historians and others when they first were colonizing Central Asia. They found it very poor. They imagined Central Asia and Central Asian peoples to be very backward compared to their more enlightened European ways, and put forth this argument that Silk Road had sunk into some kind of slough of despond as a result of opening up of another, more efficient trade circuit. Now there are various ways in which there are various problems with this argument, and I don't want to go into all of them today, but perhaps the simplest approach to it is simply empirically to look at the evidence. And what we find is, we look at 16th, 17th, 18th, even 19th century, we do see a period of sort of slowed communications perhaps, but then we see vast increase in the amounts of trade. And we start getting historical records that really give us concrete knowledge of what was moving and how much. I refer to the sort of Kazakh communications with the Chinese and trade and these sorts of things. And what it looks like, and there is also lots of evidence of Russian trade via Central Asia, in Central Asian merchants moving horses down into India in return for Indian textiles, which are then being shipped north and exchanged in Central Asia for Russian goods so that Russians can get these colorful cottons from India, which they wanted very much in the early modern and modern period. And there's a good deal of evidence along these lines that not only was there trade, but there was a good deal of it. And so what it really seems to have been the case was that after a period of sort of fragmentation following the Mongol Empire, in particular following the Timurid or Tamerlane's empire, there was reunification of these territories under new imperial powers, in particular the Qing dynasty and the Tsarist state, the Russian Tsardom. And then, as in earlier periods, those that correspond to the Han dynasty in Rome, those that correspond to the Tang dynasty in Byzantium, and the Sassanid and Arab empires, and so on, as in earlier periods of imperial unification, trade went up. Communications quickened. There was more of this sorts of cultural back and forth. So really we see then another high point, another episode like that of those empires I mentioned before, of the Mongol period itself, reoccurring in early modern times with no real discontinuity of the Silk Road. Now you can also approach this question of whether the Silk Road died at any point logically or interpretively, and here's where it depends on what you actually imagine the Silk Road to be. If you think of it as a physical road or a few physical routes, then you can imagine it being abandoned or some of the places along the way dying out. But if you treat it more as the sum total of exchanges and the long-term sort of titration back and forth of culture across Eurasia, then obviously it didn't come to an end. And so I want you to simply to consider a scenario that I'm going to read out to you right now. A country at one end of Eurasia promotes a religious system through military, political, and diplomatic means. A country on the other end, attracted by this religious system, studies it eagerly, translating its textual corpus. Envoys pass back and forth. Besides the religion itself, much else is introduced from one country and civilization to another, including technology, music, and art. One country imitates the artistic styles of the other, carving similar statuary and erecting its temples and palaces in a related architectural style. Now this could very easily describe the relationship between China and India, with Buddhism being the religion at the core of that relationship. But I want to suggest another parallel. Where is this taken? Based on the architecture. Any guesses? Margie? You know it's a trick question, right? Nobody wants to be the one tricked. But what type of architecture does it look like? Say it, David? Stalin Gothic, thank you. Not shy. All right, yes indeed. So it looks like sort of Soviet era Stalin imperial, or Galen, or I like to call it sort of wedding cake, neo-classical wedding cake architecture. If we back off and take a different frame, you'll see it's in downtown Shanghai. This is a Sino-Soviet friendship building, now the Shanghai Exhibition Center. But you recognize that yellow color, which you can see in this picture too, anyone who's been in Soviet lands. So besides architecture, we could also consider socialist realist sculpture as linking the Soviet Union and China. So here we have in the Memorial of the People's Heroes in Tiananmen Square, this very famous sculpture with these solid muscular figures, bursting out of the living rock with scowls of heroic determination. Oh, wait a minute. And so this is the carver of the Martin Luther King Memorial. So in other words, Silk Road exchanges have never really left us, I would say, but rather have become part of our global landscape today. And I'll stop my remarks right there and take any questions you have. You find local knockoffs of Sasanian coins, which are clearly not they're not minted as well. They get the reign dates and the images of the emperors and so on wrong. But someone has said, this is a valuable enough thing. We take some silver, we cheapen the silver a little bit, we knock it off. And so there again, it's the idea, right, that has taken off and that has the currency rather than the thing itself, or in addition to the thing itself.
Jim, I'm really glad you're emphasizing nomad-sided relations and the interrelationship between them. Is it fair, is there a way we can talk about more successful nomadic groups and less? Are there measures for this? I mean, what would you pick as the sort of peak of the nomad-settled flourishings?
Well, I mean, the peak would probably be the Mongol Empire. And there we have a good deal of records from various sorts of Western missionaries. There's Marco Polo. He's problematic in some ways. But William of Rubric, who's a monk who traveled from France, he describes some very interesting things. He describes the presence of all sorts of miscellaneous Europeans in the court of the Khans in what is now Beijing, or actually north of Beijing, including a French silversmith who made this very famous, fabulous silver wet bar, really, for the Mongol Khans, from which you could drink rice wine, mead, a kind of liquor, and also fermented mare's milk, sort of poured down through tubes. Now, that thing did not travel the Silk Road, but the artisan did. Right? And then the idea was brought back, and the story of it was brought back. Yeah? Yeah. So, I mean, one of the things I also try to do is expand the chronological framework of the Silk Road to make us think about this trans-Eurasian connections over a longer period of time than we usually do. And I'm arguing that we can kind of merge it into globalization on the more recent side. But if you go way back in history and into prehistory, there are some very momentous movements of people, migrations of people, and exchanges across the Silk Road, and of ideas. One of those would be obviously the populating of Eurasia by people themselves coming out of Africa. And nowadays, through DNA and genome sequencing and so on, we can tell all sorts of things about that process simply by looking at our own genetic record. Another is the domestication of horses And this is one that's, of course, very important for Central Asian, indeed all Eurasian history. And so I talked a little bit about that, and there's been some very interesting new research by archaeologists on that process, and they've argued that domestication of horses probably goes back earlier than we thought, at least to the 3rd millennium BC, or domestication earlier than that, and actually riding of horses, at least to the 3rd millennium BC. And what this means is that people who are mounted can then move further out, go further distances more easily. They can move out into the steppe, they can live out there, they can herd other horses and cattle and sheep, and the whole pastoral nomadic economy becomes possible at an earlier point. And then, of course, from that, from this association with horses and ability of horses, which the nomads of Inner Asia had, comes their military edge. Mounted horse warfare, cavalry, the mounted bowmen. And this has long-term effects on the entire arrangement of states across Eurasia. So I've moved away a little bit from biology there, but the biology of the horse is one. I'll give you one other related example. With domestication of mammals, and particularly of cattle, when people started drinking milk, obviously some populations of Eurasia can drink milk more readily than others. We talk about lactose intolerance for Asian populations. Well, actually what that is not any particular intolerance, but the lack of a mutation which allows us to digest milk, particularly the sugar lactase, after 4, 5, 6 years old, so after when we should be weaned. By looking at that mutation, which they've now isolated, you can kind of see in different populations where this is. And there's the same mutation which is shared by many Western Europeans moves out across the steppe pretty far, sort of into sort of Kazakhstan and so on, but is much less prevalent after that. But there is lactase persistence, as it's called, among some Mongol and Kazakh and other sort of nomadic peoples, and even North Chinese and so on. But it's a completely different mutation, using a different mechanism. So if you ever want a good argument in favor of the natural selection, so-called theory of evolution, this is a very good one, because humans have managed to come up with separate mutations to allow us to drink cow's milk after we're children. Not only twice, there's actually a third version of this in Africa as well. So those are the kind of biological features, sort of looking at the biological history across Eurasia as well, that I try to bring in.
Can I ask
Yeah,
a question?
please.
You spoke a good deal about how goods spread, and I was wondering what the mechanism for ideas spreading, especially in the pre-modern times. Was it a similarly incremental stage kind of movement, or did the people who carried the ideas actually travel farther?
I think, well, it's sort of hard to say if you get something showing up in different places. And you don't know necessarily the intermediate steps. You're not sure whether somebody brought it or whether the idea moved incrementally. For the example of the halo, for instance, it seems to have been incremental, sort of picked up in different places. We have examples of what could be called technology transfer from India to China, which were explicit and intentional. The Chinese emperor had read in accounts of Buddhist monks that they had ways of processing sugar. And he sent delegation to figure out this sort of sugar processing technology, which the Indians knew how to do and China didn't, and they brought it back into China. So this was in the 8th century. So there's a variety of different sorts of mechanisms. A lot of the time we don't know the mechanism, but occasionally where there's textual evidence we do.
What about religious ideas?
One of the most famous Silk Road stories, I didn't go into it, but you'll find it in any account of the Silk Road, including mine, is of the transfer of Buddhism from India to Central and then East Asia, particularly China, but from there it spread into Korea and Vietnam as well. And that involved very often the travel of individual monks and who went and studied at Buddhist colleges in India, brought back what they'd learned, but also brought back physical scriptures, most famously, by the baskets full. So, in that case, there's a concrete textual corpus that was moved over very long distances between societies that had great impact later. But not always the case. In the case of the stories that I'm talking about, for example, I'm sure it's much more of a sort of folk tradition underlying it. There's a question back there. Yeah. Uh-huh.
Valerie Hansen wrote another book on the Silk Road, and it was just last year.
Yeah.
Mentioned the silk was not actually the main commodity of export, that there were other things like glass and paper. And now, would you have any sort of idea of what their term used to describe this?
What other term? Right. Well, yeah, Valerie, I sort of read her book, came out before mine, and she's one of the people who's done this work. It tends to sort of bring the role of states and empires back in and sort of downplay the notion of the intrepid merchant traveling the whole way. Yeah, the thing about silk, I mean, at one point I was playing around with sort of a subheading that I was going to sort of borrow from the old Saturday Night Live skit, Mike Myers' Coffee Lady, and say, neither silk nor a road, discuss among yourselves. Remember that. Because in a sense, that's what is going on here. Silk was obviously an important product. Silk was traded, particularly with nomad groups from China. We have these famous comments about silk from a few Roman writers in the 1st century. But it's not clear whether their silk was actually coming from China or was another silk-like product made in Cyprus or India. And within a few centuries, in any case, the technology of silk making had escaped from China. The Persians picked it up. Ultimately, in Byzantium, they had it as well, and of course, in Europe already by the 13th, 14th century. And so China no longer had a monopoly on the products themselves, or on silk themselves. Silk is a luxury good. It's important. I think it's in a way more interesting than silk itself is the fact that wherever silk was found and was made, it tended to be worn by elites. Obviously, it's fairly expensive. But it also carried this certain cachet, which of course nowadays has been commoditized and popularized. But whether you're talking about Byzantine royals or religious elites or Persian sultans or Chinese elites, this was a product which had symbolism of, had symbolic meanings of privilege, obviously of expense, even of royalty, particularly when you dye it purple. The dyes from shellfish from Tyre off the Lebanese coast. And so the association, this is the sort of Eurasian substratum. The association of silk with royalty, I think, is a general thing. If you were going to call it something else, I don't know what else to call it, but paper route has been suggested because the spread of paper is also a Silk Road story. The famous story is that during a very brief encounter between Chinese armies and the Arabs in the 8th century in a place called Talas or Taraz in Central Asia, that Chinese captives were taken and brought to Samarkand, and there they taught people how to make paper. And Samarkand then became a paper-making center. But from there, very, very quickly, in a matter of decades, the idea of making paper and the popularity of paper spread very, very quickly to Baghdad. And there were paper-making ateliers. And this, of course, had profound effects on the spread of knowledge and information in the Islamic world, and then, of course, later in Europe, when combined with printing. It was very important indeed. So if you're looking for a single most important product, perhaps paper would be a candidate. But there's also the Manta. So the Manta route.
You opened up the your spiel about your book and said you're trying to refute the idea of perhaps the Silk Road even existing, and it made me think about with the widespread use of fossil fuels, and then of course like the closure of the Silk Road, first with Russia and then China. Is it even really? I mean, is it now kind of almost unrecognizable from what it perhaps once was? Or I mean, does it kind of make the Silk Road as like a geospatial term, I guess, even relevant?
Well, as I was saying at the beginning, it still seems to be very relevant to all sorts of people. Maybe more the historical imaginary than the reality of it. I wouldn't want to make too much of this. I would simply argue that there was no stark discontinuity. No point when the Silk Road came crashing to a halt and was replaced by something entirely different. Obviously with fossil fuels and modern communications and commodity trade, long distance trade is very different than it was in ancient world. We now move things around the world that are very, very cheap in relation to their weight. Scrap iron, grain, oil, bottled water from Fiji, crying out loud, right? So we now can afford to move things that are inexpensive. In ancient trade, not just in Eurasia, but everywhere else, if you're going to go to the trouble of moving something like that, then it has to be very, very valuable. Precious stones, very fancy manufacturers, slaves, specialized people with special skills, medicines, drugs, these kinds of things are what move. So the overall, the types of things that are moved and the quantities, of course, have changed unrecognizably. Oh.
Yes,
Oh, I'm sorry, I didn't see it. Yes.
Would it be fair to say that, leaving aside oversimplification dangers, trade led to a lot more good things, good behaviors, good economic and social and cultural consequences, interpenetration of artistic ideas across cultures, that on balance, net, trade did a lot and did good things more than it did bad things? Or was trade just kind of a side issue?
Yes. on balance, I'm sure. I mean, on balance, does more good things. Certainly, does more interesting things. I don't know. It's a hypothetical, right? There's lots of trade, lots of exchanges. I mean, the irony of it is, I think that, and if there's sort of an overall argument about the Silk Road in my book, it's that those periods of when there were larger empires, fewer polities but bigger ones, those were the periods when communications were easiest and most amount of exchange. So this, if you want to think about it in political terms, this suggests, somewhat uncomfortably for many of us, perhaps, that empires are good for trade, which is good for exchange and communication in ancient times, rather than lots of small independent polities and things. Now, of course, you have to remember, these empires are not homogenizing cultural monsters, juggernauts. They're political military structures that sit on top of a lot of local and regional diversity, allowing local control by local authorities, lots of different languages spoken, often different religions, and so on. But they're not spunky little Greek city-states. They're the Persian Empire.
Well, thank you very much, Professor Millward.